recording. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about Ardipithecus and Homo sapiens and human evolution, and we're going to look at changes in skull architecture and anatomy and how that relates to social evolution, language and music. And if you look at the different skulls here, we've got an infant chimpanzee, an adult chimpanzee, and a group of hominins from Ardipithecus to Homo sapiens, and we're going to look at changes in skull architecture. And the aims of the lecture is to provide a brief overview of literature on human evolution from 4.5 million years ago to the present, and I want to explain unique human capacities such as language, music, dance, technology and social cooperation. And this picture just illustrates the progression we're going to be looking at. Here's Ardipithecus ramidus. It's an arboreal, very early hominin, and we move through the Australopithecines to Homo erectus and Neanderthals and to Homo sapiens. There's just some very, very simple ideas that I want you to learn from this lecture, and I'm going to dig down deeper and deeper into them as I go through the lecture. But really the main ideas are that we are a erect bipedal primate, and most other primates, they live in trees and they use their hands for grasping. Because we're an erect bipedalist, we walk upright, our upper limbs and hands are emancipated from locomotion, and that's really important for technological innovation, tool manufacture, using your phones, computers, things like that. So locomotion is important, and also what is important is we don't have a very big canine. All other primates have large canines, and they're particularly large in the males, and the males use them in tournament behaviour, fighting against one another. And the winner in these kind of tournaments becomes the alpha male, and he'll have privileged sexual access to the females. So the canines is the means by which other primates establish a dominance hierarchy. In hominins, the canine doesn't exist, and in humans it doesn't exist. We don't have a big canine, and it's thought that there may have been a very early change in social and mating systems where males, instead of fighting with one another, may have started to invest in offspring, and the birth of kind of paternal investment in offspring. So these are the two main ideas: erect posture, hands and canines, that I'm going to look at in significant detail. Now, what I want you to look at is this picture here, and this is the growth of the chimpanzee skull, and this is the growth of the human skull. And one of the theories to describe this phenomenon of the loss of the canine and the loss of the large projecting snout is self-domestication and what they call pediomorphic skull morphogenesis, or pediomorphic just means childlike. So there's this idea that humans retain childlike skull shape into the period of sexual maturity. Not so much size, but shape. And when you look at an infant chimpanzee and then a juvenile and then an adult, you can see there's a change in the skull shape, and there's a kind of elongation of the skull and projection of the face. When you look at the change from an infant human to an adult human, you can see that the adult human retains the kind of globular skull shape of the infant, and you don't get this growth of the face, and you don't get these brow ridges. The pediomorphous theory has been used to explain the transition from more robust humans with the big supraorbital tori or brow ridges and the projecting face, and the movement to a more globular brain case and a flatter face, and that's thought to be the retention of sub-adult or juvenile shape into the period of sexual maturity. This is a book that is really good to look at the coevolution of the hands and the brain, and you can get it online through the Bar Smith, so I recommend it if you want to look into this issue further. And Lomborg looks at the emancipation of the forelimbs from locomotion. That's obviously very important for our ability to carry food and share with others, and it also means that we end up having an opposable thumb, which is very important for precision grasping and tool making. And he argues that it's not so much our intelligence that distinguishes us from other primates, but the morphology of our hands and the process of coevolution that's set in motion. And there's this quote that I really like from the book, and this kind of sums up the essence of what I'm trying to get across in this lecture. The hands are intelligent and full of silent knowledge. These are some of the things that humans do that we don't see in any other primates or any other mammals that result from our unique anatomical configuration. And we have the internet, we have space travel, we have computers, and we have complex societies with complex and sophisticated infrastructure. And it's really quite unusual. No other primate or no other mammal does these kinds of things. And here's another really interesting book by Frank Wilson called The Hand, and if you want to look at the evolution and the anatomy of the hand, it's an excellent book and I highly recommend it. And he argues that many uniquely human behaviours require very complex coordination between hands and the brain. And here's an example. Extreme mountain climbing, for example, you have to have very, very strong hands and very, very complex coordination between the hands and the brain, and juggling, very refined motor skills, and same with puppeteers. These are uniquely human behaviours that we don't see anywhere else in the animal kingdom. Also, the unique anatomical configuration of humans seems to be associated with our ability to play music. The evolution of music is a very important research area at the moment, and in music there's complex integration between the hands and emotional brain systems, and music is often an embodied form of communication, frequently without language, particularly if it's instrumental music. So it can be a pre-linguistic form of communication. And this quote here is just to try to get across to you the idea I'm trying to express in the lecture, and the notion of music as an evolved human adaptation. Music is the expression of emotion utilising the combined and integrated capacities of unique morphological structures such as precision grasping of the hand and very specific vocal tract and skull architecture that facilitates the modulation of vocalisation and production of melody. All of these capacities are related to our unique locomotor adaptation, that is erect bipedalism. When looking at the evolution of music, though, it's probably best to focus on small-scale foraging or hunter-gatherer communities who probably reflect our ancient ancestors more than music does in our society, in Western societies. So in small-scale societies, the human body is a kind of an integrated vocal and gestural communicative system. And in non-Western cultures or foraging communities, music and dance and song are integrated into ritual life and religious life. And song and dance facilitates social bonding, promotes pro-social behaviour, and often it'll be involved in evoking altered states of consciousness or trance states. And there's archaeological evidence for dance going back 7,000 years, as you can see here, but it's probably much older than that. That's just the earliest evidence in the archaeological record. The black and white picture here, this is a group of African foragers, the Kung or the San Bushmen, and when they have ritual quite often, a couple of times a month I think, and what happens is the women sit in the middle and they sing songs and the men dance around them all night. Often they'll start at sunset and continue all the way through till the morning. And often the shaman, he will collapse into a trance state and then involve himself in healing, either psychological or physical healing. And this is just a quote about the Bushmen and how one of them conceives of why they go to ceremony. Everyone who goes to the ceremony gets an open heart and feels good about the community, even forgiving someone who stole his wife. So that suggests that song and dance and ritual are ways of reducing social tensions and also promoting pro-social behaviour and social bonding. To look at the role of dance and music and song in human evolution, another approach is Aboriginal communities. And the black and white picture up the top, you can see the men are creating a sand mosaic. And when Aboriginal people create sand mosaics, they're virtually a scaled down map of country. And the different icons on the mosaic may represent kangaroo hunting grounds or mountains or rivers, things like that. And when the men dance, they dance through the sand mosaic often, reenacting the movements of the dreaming ancestors across the country, the dreaming ancestors that are thought to have created the landscape. Essentially what they're doing is by dancing through these sand mosaics, they are encoding within their consciousness a map of country. So they're encoding cartographic space within their consciousness through song and dance. And by doing so, they're able to learn where the best hunting grounds are and how to become men who can support a family. And until they've learnt the songs and dances, they're not given the responsibilities of an adult man, and they're not thought to be capable of providing for and protecting a family. We're familiar with a lot of these mosaics now because Aboriginal people paint them on canvas using acrylics, and they've become famous throughout the art world. But traditionally, they are actually mosaics painted on the ground or on the body as well. This is a book that I've put on the reading list, Merlin Donald's Origins of the Modern Mind, and he has an interesting theory about the evolution of dance and music, language and tool making. And he argues that all of these aspects of human behaviour involve mimesis or imitation, where you learn from other generations through copying them. So he argues there's symbiosis between brain and culture. Humans learn through imitation or mimesis. And he believes that mimesis may have began at 1.5 million years ago with Homo erectus. And evidence for that is because we start seeing more evidence of tools in the archaeological record, and that suggests higher levels of collaboration and cooperation for hunting and things like that. This may have given rise to shared attention and theory of mind. If you want to go and hunt the same animal, you all have to focus on a shared goal, so you have to have shared intentionality and theory of mind, that is having a metacognitive capacity about the thoughts that other people have, which will help you collaborate and coordinate your activities. He argues that pre-linguistic symbolic traditions such as rituals, dance and craft emerged possibly before language, and that mimetic motor adaptation set the stage for later evolution of language. So if you're copying the dance moves of someone else or a kind of theatrical performance, that may have been something that was easier to evolve than complex syntax and grammar or language. And mimetic skill results in the diffusion of new technologies and knowledge. And he talks about external memory devices such as art, writing and the internet, where instead of having knowledge stored within your individual brain, we can kind of store it in these external memory devices, and that results in the evolution of culture, and the brain evolves within a cultural context. And he says that culture is a kind of collective mind. And there's just a picture of Homo erectus, and you can see there's tool manufacture and cooperation with hunting and provisioning and food acquisition and things like that. I want to look a little more closely at the evolution of singing, and this is a really good book if you want to look into this subject in more detail, The Singing Neanderthals by Stephen Mithen. Now, what's interesting to note in recent research into the psychology and evolution of music, they've found that music seems to develop in humans before language. So you look at young children, and if there's a band playing or music playing or whatever, they will instinctively gravitate towards it and start moving their limbs and rhythmically engaging with the music. And they do this before they can speak. They do this before language develops. And they've also found that infants from birth actually have quite acute rhythmic and pitch perception. So this has been used as evidence that music in humans is actually a biological adaptation, that it's actually been selected for, and it's very important to the emergence of humans. And Mithen argues that the same way that music develops before language in ontogeny or individual development, that there may have been a similar development of a musical kind of proto-language before language development evolved in our species. That is, the phylogeny of language development may have paralleled the ontogeny. That is, individual development may go through similar stages that we went through as a species. This is just a study on 4-year-olds and joint rhythmic movement. And what they found is if they got this group of 4-year-olds and they had them engage in joint rhythmic movement or kind of dance and music-like activity, they actually were more cooperative and they were able to collaborate in a task more effectively than if they didn't engage in those kind of tasks. So in the same way that rhythmic, coordinated or synchronised movement in humans and in ritual facilitates social bonding, this seems to happen at a very, very young age in development, suggesting that it's kind of wired into our biology. This is a book that I think is very interesting by Dean Falk, Finding Our Tongues, Mothers, Infants and the Origins of Language. And Falk developed the thesis called the Putting the Baby Down thesis. And this is based on the idea that when people talk to babies, it's a different kind of communication than when you talk to adults. It's called motherese or infant-directed speech. And she argues that when humans became bipedal, and for example, when an ancient human mother is foraging, and because she's bipedal, she's not carrying the baby, and she puts the baby down, and as she's pulling tubers from the ground or collecting fruits and berries, the baby will become anxious because it's separated from the mother. And because there's no longer tactile contact comfort, the mother will just have these kind of sing-song vocalisations to reassure the baby, and the baby will respond back, and that establishes a kind of vocal contact comfort, if you like, in the absence of tactile comfort. And that vocal synchrony is thought to facilitate the mother-infant bond and eventually result in the evolution of language. And here's another paper, If Music is the Food of Love, What About Survival and Reproductive Success? And in that paper it's argued that these very early vocal or reciprocal vocalisations between mother and infant provided the developmental foundation for music and language and forms of social bonding in adulthood, in romantic attachments and in ritual and these kinds of things. So this is an argument that these early forms of attachment lay the foundation for forms of attachment in later periods of life. This is a book by Joseph Heinrich, and he brings together a lot of the data on self-domestication and on ritual, and he thinks that humans have a kind of collective mind and that we develop cooperation through self-domestication, that is, selection for social tolerance and reduced aggression. And the important point in this book and in the articles that he's written with other people is he's looked at data suggesting that ritual facilitates the formation of larger social aggregates. So if you have a very, very ancient human population and they're engaging in ritual and dance and music to establish social cohesion, if they join together and have a ritual with 3 or 4 other communities, then what's going to happen is those communities are going to be able to exchange information and knowledge much more effectively. So if one of the people in one group thinks up a new tool, a more productive way of making a tool, or hunting and gathering or whatever, when they meet up with other groups for ritual activity, they will exchange knowledge. And he found the larger the social aggregates, the more effective was the accumulation, diffusion of knowledge. So greater social networks create a kind of ratcheting up effect in knowledge accumulation. And we can see that the internet is kind of the apotheosis of that, where you have millions upon millions of people contributing to this external memory storage device, if you like, which is the internet. And these are some of the bits of evidence that Heinrich looks at. And what he talks about is when Europeans first colonised Australia, they brought camels with them. When camels came into Australia, they flourished because the ecological niche in Australia is similar to the ecological niche in the Middle East where they came from. But when humans came here and explorers such as Burke and Wills tried to survive in the Australian continent, particularly in the desert, they frequently died. And that's because humans are not anatomically or physiologically adapted to any specific ecological niche. Now, Aboriginal people, they survive quite easily in the Australian continent, and it's not because of their anatomy and physiology, it's because they have a culture that gives them the knowledge within which they're able to survive. As we saw the young boys and men dancing, they're learning about country through myth, ritual and dance. So the thing to remember is humans are not adapted to any specific ecological niche, yet we have colonised virtually every ecological niche on the planet, yet we are adapted to none of them specifically. Okay, but we are adapted to culture. This is a very important experiment that when we're looking at self-domestication and changes in human skull architecture, this has been used as a way of explaining that. And in Russia there was this experiment where they got a population of foxes and they put them in a cage, and the experimenter put their hand in the cage with an oven mitt on, And most of the foxes would either bite, be aggressive, or be fearful and cowering in the corner, but say 1 or 2 out of the population would be friendly towards the experimenter and just come up and curiously sniff the glove or whatever. So what they did is they took those less aggressive individuals out of the population and then bred a new population from that, from those tamer individuals, and then they did the same with that population, and they did it over and over and over again until they developed a population of domesticated foxes that were actually affectionate towards humans and that didn't show the aggression of wild foxes. The really, really interesting thing to note is that by selecting on one behavioural trait, that is lack of aggression or tameness, there was a developmental cascade where a whole lot of physiological, hormonal and morphological features kind of came along for the ride. They didn't select for those things, but they came along with selection for tameness. And those features were reduced robusticity of the face, so less facial projection. They don't have the big canines and the big robust faces like their wild ancestors. There was changes in the patterning of the coat that was more like juvenile foxes. And there was also development of mutual gazing or theory of mind. So when you have a dog, it can follow your gaze, and if I look at something over there, the dog will follow my gaze. Wild animals don't do that, but humans do that. So through domestication, this experiment suggests that the reason, or one of the ways that dogs were domesticated, is that we kind of created a human-like brain in dogs, and that's why they can interact with us so effectively. But what happened is the foxes ended up becoming puppy-like or juvenile-like into the period of sexual maturity. And that's what it's argued dogs are. Through over thousands of years, we've selected for these less aggressive, more pediomorphic or juvenile traits within dogs. This is a paper that I've put on the reading list, and I suggest you read it. It's an excellent paper. Survival of the friendliest. Homo sapiens evolved via selection for prosociality. And Hare uses the Russian fox experiment to explain changes in craniofacial shape throughout human evolution. And we have here in the more robust humans, you have the robust brow ridges and the projecting face. And slowly, as we move towards the present, you see more globular neurocranium and less projecting face, a flatter face. And you can kind of see the transition here with these skulls on the table there. And here's an example of the change from the ancestral wolf to the domestic dog. Okay, what I want you to do is keep all of these ideas in mind, the idea of self-domestication, changes in craniofacial shape, and pediomorphic or childlike shape of the skull persisting into the period of sexual maturity. And I'm going to use that as an interpretive framework to try to understand Ardipithecus ramidus, this very early hominin. Ardipithecus ramidus is dated at about 4.5 million years old. It's a bipedal or upright walking hominin. It doesn't have the canine complex that other primates have, and it's thought to have been partially arboreal but also terrestrial. This is an important thing to understand when you're looking at human evolution. It's called the CP3 complex, and as I mentioned, the dentition in other primates is quite dangerous and lethal, and that's because the upper canine, when the jaw opens and closes, it sharpens against the premolar, and it's like a knife sharpener, and it keeps these teeth very, very sharp, and chimpanzees have been known to disembowel other chimpanzees using this very, very sharp CP3 or canine honing complex. You can see here Ardipithecus ramidus in the chimpanzee. Not only does the chimpanzee have a much more projecting face, and it has the canines, these are two features that you don't see as being as pronounced in Ardipithecus ramidus. The face is not as projecting, and there's no CP3 complex in Ardipithecus ramidus. And this is thought to provide evidence that possibly the males weren't having to be so aggressive in order to be successfully reproductive, that they were possibly investing in offspring, and there was pair bond formation. Okay, this is the paper that Marche and I published last year, and we used the self-domestication hypotheses and the idea of pediomorphic skull morphogenesis to explain the Ardipithecus skull. And we argued, like Niffen and Falk and other people, that there may have been a form of proto-music language that evolved before language, This is not a new idea, it's an idea that Darwin put forward in The Descent of Man, and I'll just read what Darwin said about this. Whether or not the half-human progenitors of man possessed, like singing gibbons, the capacity for producing, and therefore no doubt of appreciating musical notes, we know that man possessed these faculties at a very remote period. And here you can see gibbons, and they use melodic vocalisations or singing to attract a mate and establish pair bonds. And birds do the same thing. So there's, although music seems to be unique in humans in that it helps in the formation of large social groups and social bonding, there are antecedents in the animal kingdom, so it's not completely unique. This is a paper that was published just this year, and they seem to be suggesting the same idea that we suggested in our paper, that there's a correlation between the evolution of language and the evolution of social and mating systems. And they talk about serotonin. Serotonin is upregulated in humans, it's upregulated in domesticated species, and it's associated with empathy and morality and things like that. So that's a really good paper to read to understand this stuff. Okay, now I want to look at the human vocal tract and the evolution of language, and how we approached the evolution of language in our paper. Humans have a one-to-one ratio between the vertical vocal tract and the horizontal vocal tract, which means they're about the same size from the larynx up to the roof of the mouth, and from the back of the throat to the lips, essentially. Chimpanzees don't have that. They have a very long horizontal vocal tract, but a short vertical one. And this one-to-one ratio is thought to enable us to speak and modulate air as it comes out of the lungs. The important thing to remember is that the reason the vocal tract is shorter in the horizontal dimension is related to the retraction of the face and the canine honing complex. But this one-to-one ratio is very important to produce what are called quantal vowels, A, E and U, and they're vowels which exist in every language on the planet. And because the larynx is down here, we have these resonance chambers, and when you produce vowels, you actually put the tongue in a different place, and that modulates the air so that we can create these different sounds that enable us to communicate. Chimpanzees have an anatomical configuration that prevents that. And this is what we did when we looked at the Ardipithecus skull, which is this one here, and we compared the Ardipithecus skull with an adult chimpanzee and with an infant chimpanzee, which is the little one down here. And here you can see these are the vocal folds, this is the hyoid bone, and this is the horizontal portion of the vocal tract, and this is the vertical portion. This is looking from the bottom of the skull. This is the infant chimpanzee, this is Homo sapiens, us, this is Ardipithecus ramidus, and this is the adult chimpanzee. The thing I want you to note is the infant chimpanzee has this globular form in the skull, like we do, and it also doesn't have the projecting face, like the adult chimpanzee does. And this here is the foramen magnum, this hole in the bottom of the skull through which the spinal cord connects with the brain. And you can see I put this dark bar here is the spinal cord. Okay, you can see in Ardipithecus ramidus and the infant chimpanzee it's coming out of the bottom of the skull, whereas in the adult chimpanzee it's coming out of the back of the skull. And that's because it's a quadruped. The spinal cord comes out of the back of the skull like your dog or like a tiger or other quadrupeds. Now what happens is the foramen magnum and this here basin, this is the interior-most point of the foramen magnum. The foramen magnum and basin migrates backwards throughout chimpanzee ontogeny or development. But in humans it stays in the infantile position, and similarly with Ardipithecus ramidus. And this results in a shorter distance between basin and the interior-most point of the dentition. In chimpanzees you can see that this distance is much greater, and essentially that's measuring the distance between the back of the throat and the interior-most point of the dentition. And this creates a very, very long horizontal vocal tract in chimpanzees. This is one of the measures that we used, and we measured basion to prostheon, which is a measure of the horizontal vocal tract, and we looked at it as a percentage of epithecranium to nasal, as a percentage of the cranial vault. And this gave us indices that measured the length of the horizontal portion of the vocal tract in relation to the size of the cranial vault. So it gave us an indication of changes in the shape of the skull, but not change, or it meant that we're measuring changes in shape but not size. So you can get similar shape formation in a small and a large skull. And this is what we found here, that A-raminostat ratio actually clusters with the juveniles or closer to the juveniles and the infants, and it's distinctly different from the adults. So that's just because it doesn't have a projecting face. This is when we looked at the angulation of the cranial base, and as chimpanzees mature, the cranial base opens up and the foramen magnum migrates backwards because they're quadrupedal. And in humans, we have a flexed cranial base, and we measured the angle of the cranial base, and we plotted that with infants and juveniles, and A-ramus again plotted with infants and juveniles, and was different to adult chimpanzees. If you want to look at that in more detail and how we tried to predict the landmarks to infer the cranial base from a species which we don't have any internal landmarks, you can read the paper and find out more about that. So essentially what we concluded is that Ardipithecus ramidus has pediomorphic skull dimensions, and that paved the way for not only reduced aggression but also language evolution, because it resulted in more human-like vocal tract architecture. And that was also related to bipedalism, because the spinal cord's coming out the bottom of the skull, it produces a shorter horizontal vocal tract. Now I want to move on and look at the hands and also link that together with the origins of bipedalism. Here's a chimpanzee hand and here's a human hand, and in the chimpanzee hand you can see that the fingers are very long and the thumb's short, and that's because chimpanzees are still living in the trees and they're using their hands for grasping hold of the branches. Humans, because of our longer thumb and our shorter fingers, we're able to grasp hold of tools and make tools and things like that. So the hand morphology, because they're not in the trees, then it's thought that we're able to develop complex technologies because we have precision grasping and those sort of things. This is another really important thing to look at, is that chimpanzees, when they do come on the ground, they engage in knuckle walking. So they put their hands on the ground, and the metacarpals actually have this dorsal ridge on them here on the metacarpals. There's a chimpanzee metacarpal, there's Ardipithecus ramidus, and there's a human, and you can see Ardipithecus ramidus is very much like a human. And this dorsal ridge actually prevents the phalanges from bending back up, and the chimpanzees also have very stable and solid wrist bones. So they have a robust hand, but it means that they're not very good at complex manipulative capacities to the degree that humans are. So Ardipithecus ramidus is thought to be still arboreal, but when it was in the trees it was engaging in what we call palmagrade locomotion like that, or walking and holding onto the trees, but not swinging through the trees like a chimpanzee would. But when Ardipithecus ramidus came onto the ground, it's believed that it was upright or bipedal. So Ardipithecus ramidus has these traits associated with bipedalism, and it also has a human hand, a more generalised hand that's not adapted for knuckle walking. And this is thought to have paved the way for human tool manufacture, brain evolution, etc. Here's just some work that's been done on the human hand and how it facilitated the production of tools and hunting, and if you can create bow and arrows, etc., and complex tools, you can improve your diet and help yourself and your social group. And these are just some studies that looked at the relationship between tool manufacture and language, and they found that people can learn how to make a tool from someone through imitation, but if they're using language, that obviously helps them a great deal. And that makes sense, because if you're wanting to teach a young person, you're a Homo erectus or whatever, and you're trying to teach a young person how to make a tool, it helps if you have some form of communicative capacity, whether it be a form of proto-language or fully developed language. And here's another paper that's on the cognitive demands of Paleolithic tool making. And tool manufacturing is thought to involve this neural hub called the default mode network. And our ability, prospection, which is the ability to project yourself into the future and imagine future scenarios. For example, if you want to make a tool, you have to imagine getting a piece of wood, getting a stone, putting it together, how you're going to manufacture it, and then hunting. So you have to create a kind of virtual inner world of what you're going to do in the future and rehearse it in your mind. This is a kind of very complex cognitive capability that humans have. Okay, now I want to look at bipedalism and infant infant care. Let's go back. What I want you to think of is that humans, because we don't have the long fingers for grasping branches in the trees like other primates, this also means that infants have reduced capacity for grasping. Now, chimpanzees, they can grasp hold of their mother, and that's because they have a grasping capacity that's necessary when they're an adult. But if early in the human lineage we lost the grasping capacity, this means that infants have to be carried, and they cannot grab hold of the mother. And because chimpanzees are quadrupedal, the infants can, or the young chimpanzees can ride on the back. This is not possible when you're a biped, the baby will just slip off, so they have to be held. This is thought to have quite profound implications for human brain growth and social development. And this is a paper by Dean Falk, who developed the Mother Ease thesis I spoke about earlier. And I've put this paper on the reading list. And what you can notice here is this is age, and this is brain growth. And as you can see, chimpanzee brain growth tails off quite early, whereas in humans it develops. And human infants are very, very immature. So when they're born, they don't have the kind of motor development that you get in other animals. For example, when deer are born, they just get up on their legs and are kind of independent very, very quickly. Human children are not independent for quite some time. There's this idea that human gestation is actually is about 21 months. That you have in utero gestation and fetal brain growth rates, and they continue for the first year of life. So when you're looking at a newborn infant, you're actually looking at a fetus that is ex utero, because brain growth rates that happen in utero and other primates usually stop at birth, whereas for humans, those brain growth rates extend into the first year of life. And that extended brain growth happens in a very, very enriched social environment where there's lots of people talking. You might have lullabies and sing-song and mutual gazing, and they're embedded in this very, very rich social environment while the brain's still growing. So this is thought to be a very, very important aspect of human uniqueness. The term for it is secondary altriciality or immaturity. And this is where intersubjectivity develops between mother and mother-infant bonding through vocalisation. Okay, just one last thing before I finish off. I want to look at psychopathology in the social brain, and is the human brain adaptive? And I've looked at the fact that we have an extended period of brain growth, and that's related to our posture and things like that. And human brain growth continues, or brain development continues into adolescence and quite later in development. And that's so that we can acquire the social skills that we need, the cultural competencies, the linguistic abilities in this kind of very, very enriched social environment. So we're kind of apprenticed into our culture. And that's how social cognition develops. And we have this internal virtual reality, so we can replay in our mind certain things that we want to do in the future, and we can ruminate and meditate on them, and that can be very beneficial, and it's probably been highly adaptive in our lineage, but it can also be maladaptive. That capacity to internally ruminate on your social existence can become overheated, if you like, and it can precipitate mental illness. Adolescence is a vulnerable period of socio-emotional development, so that extended period of brain development makes us vulnerable to psychopathology. Internal rumination is implicated in psychopathology, and there's a correlation between creativity and psychopathology. So these are just 3 books that are looking at this topic: The Descent of Madness, Evolutionary Origins of Psychosis and the Social Brain, and Strong Imagination. This is an excellent book that looks at similarities between psychoses and creativity, and he compares the works of Shakespeare with a psychotic person, and he says that these people, because of their internal world that they're able to create, they were able to create fictional worlds of great complexity. The difference is Shakespeare knew that they were fictional, and a psychotic person doesn't. They take the creations of their imagination for reality, and that's where you can have forms of psychotic breakdown and things like that. But these books, and there's another one by Dean Falk on the evolution of Asperger's syndrome. But all of these books suggest that our advanced cognitive adaptations that have been adaptive in ancestral environments, helping us collaborate, giving us advanced social cognition, theory of mind, metacognition, all of these kind of capacities that, while being adaptive, they can actually have maladaptive byproducts. And humans are unusual in that we do develop, we have high rates of psychopathology, and it's a bit of an enigma from a Darwinian perspective, because psychopathology correlates strongly with suicide. So if we're in a kind of Darwinian game of reproductive success and you're not reproducing, then why does psychopathology evolve? It's a bit of a conundrum in evolutionary studies, but this is one way of approaching it. Okay, just summary and conclusions. Pediomorphic skull morphology emerges very early in hominin evolution with Ardipithecus ramidus here at 4.5 million years ago. Loss of projecting face and aggressive canine complex suggests elevated levels of cooperation and prosociality. Self-domestication is a possible mechanism for changes in anatomy and social behaviour. Erect bipedalism emancipated hands from locomotion. More cooperative and collaborative social structure facilitated intergenerational transfer of knowledge. Cooperative and collaborative social structure combined with generalised hand morphology drove brain evolution. The human brain is adapted to culture as opposed to a specific environmental niche. The human brain acquires linguistic and cultural knowledge through imitation. In pre-modern cultures, music, dance, myth and ritual are primary means of transferring knowledge between generations. And the internet is essentially a prosthetic collective mind enfolding the globe, a kind of artificial planetary neural network. And I've put the picture of Homo erectus there and the connection with the internet, and showing that you have collaborative hunting and the formation of culture where people will store knowledge and then pass it on through the generations, and then the move to the internet. So what we have now, a kind of global system of storing knowledge, we can probably trace this back to very, very ancient adaptations, but it's just ratcheted up and much more complex. Okay. Thank you.
Gary, there is some time for questions. Or look at the phone, yes? There will be a practical a week after next where we will look at the skulls and on the bottom.
What was that, sorry? Well, this is the one I spoke about. So Ardipithecus ramidus. It's not all of them, but this just shows the general trend towards reduction of the face. And you can see here, this is Homo erectus, 1.8 million years, and you can see that the face is reducing there. This is Neanderthal, isn't it, Martin?
It is.
Yeah, Neanderthal, and then that's us. So you can see the loss. If you look at a chimpanzee, you see the big brow ridges, and they're kind of reducing here in Ardipithecus ramidus at 4 million years old. Homo erectus, they're still there, and the face is still projecting. Neanderthals, they're still there, but then when you look at humans, like it's becoming much more globular. The brain trace is much more globular, and then when you look at the infant chimpanzee, like it doesn't have those. Do you see what I'm saying?
I see that big brow ridge.
Yeah.
Tapering off all the way to
Yeah.
lower it down.
Yeah. And I don't know much. I think some of the theories are it's because of the expansion of the frontal bones. We do have the brow ridges, but they're kind of sunk into the skull. I'm not sure what you think about them.
Well, the face got smaller.
Yeah.
Got tucked under the brain.
Yeah.
The main difference between, let's say, the Neanderthal and Homo sapiens is not the brain size. The brain is bigger,
Yeah.
but the face is smaller.
Could it be the morphological change in the brain as we progress in intelligence and our tools become more complicated? The frontal lobe increases, driving this kind of cranial morphology to go from this kind of slanted, tapered end to more of a bigger frontal cortex.
Now, actually, the cranial didn't follow. The guy did a lot of studies on cranial endocardium, the shape of the inside of the skull.
Yep.
And there, it's also already very similar to this. So its brain developed its human-like capacities very early on. We just kept using it. But if you met this fellow, you would be able to have a conversation.
There's an interesting paper that I put on the, I think it's on the reading list. If you just come here, I'll show you.
These are going to be on my uni.
What was that, sorry?
Are these going to be on my uni?
Yeah, yeah.
So we go through all these.
This one here, this is a study that he quotes in this book here. And what they found is when they do studies of working memory and intellectual capacities, they find that humans are not that much better than chimpanzees, okay, in terms of, like, chimpanzees can do some working memory tasks better than humans, but it's social intelligence that's important. So when they measured children and chimpanzees, there's not that much difference. But children have greater social intelligence. So if you drop something on the ground, a child will just straight away look at it and give it to you, or you know, it's engaged, it's in a social environment. So theory of mind.
Say you're a child and you point to something,
Yeah.
or a tame dog and they look straight away.
Yeah.
Wild animals they don't.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's,
Exactly.
Yeah. So I'm very scientific
Ah, this stuff will be really interesting for you.
You know what? And something I thought was would be interesting to see the neural connections you know how you use diffuse tensor engine to see the axons throughout the brain. Compare that to an adult chimp to an adult human.
Yeah.
And see who has greater projections.
Yes.
Like just precisely once we started.
Yeah,
So
there's.
you then can make an argument for, you know, greater projections, you know, greater intelligence.
I think that like there's the default mode network's interesting on that, and there's stuff on pyramidal neurons. But what I would argue is that, like, when you come here, you've got Neanderthals, and Neanderthals actually have bigger brains than us. So there's been reduction in brain size. So if brain expansion is the key, then why does brain size reduce during evolutionary history? And what I'm sort of arguing that it's not so much the size of the brain and it's not so much intelligence, it's upregulation of pro-social hormones, okay, like oxytocin, serotonin, things like this. And it's not, and that's the point I'm trying to get across, is that what makes us unique is that we're pro-social and we're able to learn from others. It's not necessarily our raw cognitive power. Do you know what I mean? Like when Burke and Wills went into the desert, if they were so smart, why did they die? You know what I mean? They weren't that bright unless they had a culture within which their brain develops and then they can acquire knowledge. So it's not. I don't think we're that intelligent at all. It's just that we have intergenerational knowledge transfer. And we can learn from others, and we have a cultural niche in which we can store knowledge, either through song and myth and those kind of things, oral traditions, or in writing and all that sort of stuff. So I think there's too much emphasis on humans being this kind of intelligent ape with a big brain. If brain size was so important, why does it reduce over the last 10,000 years?
Yeah. Well, brain size isn't
Yeah, exactly.
Yes. Neuronal connections, strengthening those synapses. So so that would make that would have that large progress.
Yes.
From strengthening connections.
And in Homo erectus, like we find tools in collaborative hunting with the Damanese fossils about 1.8, and their brains are not much bigger than chimpanzees. They're quite small, but they're upright. They're not using their hands for locomotion, so they're able to live in cooperative groups. So I think the real issue is our anatomical configuration, and that's why you see the growth of the brain here, but you find tools much earlier than brain expansion, and you find the loss of the canine 2 million years before you find any increase in brain size. So what's happening here? Why are these creatures losing their canines? So I'm arguing you can actually evolve very collaborative social groups without any necessary changes in size. And
it's still recording. That is still recording.
all right. Like they often contrast the chimpanzees and the bonobos, and they have very, very different social structures. But there's